Hello, my name's Mike Williams. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're talking to Compulsion Games, the developer of We Happy Few. We Happy Few is a game set in an alternate 1960s England where everything is an awful lot worse, but people are for some reason a lot happier. It's very creepy. It's a game for the PS4, PC and Xbox One, and it's very different to the one that we got 2 years ago in early access.
I want you to have fish.
Got you!
Here to talk a little bit more about it is Compulsion Games producer Sam Abbott. Hi Sam.
Hello, how's it going?
Very good, thank you, very good. We Happy Few has changed a lot since it was first revealed in 2015. What have been the biggest changes to you?
I mean, it's pretty much fundamentally changed from the time it was revealed in 2015. The introduction of the story on Friday is probably going to be the single biggest change that happened throughout development, but we've had a lot of certainly what felt like very big changes at the time. So, for example, we did a few things that were quite surprising to people. So we moved away from a permadeath game. We got rid of that, and we said, okay, well, people are much more interested in story and our environment and exploring and that sort of thing, and it made it very difficult to have a permadeath game when your game suddenly gets longer and longer and more difficult. So we said, okay, that could be optional. We changed our survival mechanics as well, and again, that was because of feedback. People saying, no, I don't want to be in the middle of a cutscene and worrying about starving to death in the next 30 seconds. There's a real huge disconnect there between survival mechanics and the idea of a narrative-driven game. So that was a big change. And otherwise, the scope increases was pretty massive. The quality increase was pretty massive over the last 3 years. And if you don't believe me, go see the first videos and you'll hopefully you'll see it.
How has the process been for you as developers, kind of changing the scope of the game and, the vision of the game has changed? How's that been for you?
That's been quite tricky. It's both quite difficult to accomplish changing the nature of parts of your game while retaining the core of what you think makes it what it is, while still attempting to have some sort of controlled budget and production process. The upside, I think, is that we had more of an opportunity to build what we had really wanted to do, but said there's no way we ever could. And that's kind of the story of We Happy Few, is saying, okay, well, actually there are a lot of people that are interested in the game and in what we really want to do, but can't, so why don't we, I guess, try and do it? I think it's much closer to the potential we have of the studio than what it was 3 years ago. So the biggest plus is being able to do work that we're much more proud of, I would say.
Do you think the players of that original early access version, do you think they're going to be surprised with the game that is presented to them?
I think it really depends. If they've been following along development since that time, I think they won't be super surprised. At the same time, it's probably a lot bigger than what people think. We've been saying for 3.5 years, don't worry, the story's coming. Don't worry. Really, I'm not kidding. And so I guess for some people who weren't following all of that, and they just played the first game and then they play the game that comes out on Friday, they'll be probably quite shocked in terms of what the game is now compared to what it was back then.
At this point then, how would you best pitch this game? Just imagine whoever's watching this video has no idea about this game. How would you best pitch this game? Because it is quite a difficult game to pitch, I would imagine.
We've not always been the biggest fans of pitching our own games because we pitch it one way and then people tell us the exact different thing. And so we've taken the approach of asking people for quite some time now, well, what do you think this game is? And it's caused us a lot of problems because I want to take you right back to PAX in 2015, early PAX, when we showed the first basic demo. And pretty much the whole story of We Happy Few starts with people saying, God, this is great. Don't Starve meets Bioshock. And we were like, that's awesome. We were hoping Don't Starve meets another indie title that our 7-person team at the time could build. That was the first time that we realized that people's expectations for the game were becoming much greater than we could deliver with the team and with the design that we had. Fast forward to now, we've had some playtests conducted over the past 4 to 6 months or so. The main goal of those playtests was to be like, okay, so you get into the game, do you know what you need to do? Because certainly in early access, people said, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea how to survive. I don't know what to do. I don't know where I'm going. And I'm just going to go over here and store 65 bodies in a bathtub. And you're like, okay, that's excellent, but for the story game, we want people to be able to get through it. We want to teach and introduce mechanics. Those playtests helped us a lot with that, but they also helped us because we asked them, how would you describe the game? The current one is, it's now Skyrim meets Bioshock, so it's even worse than it was before, unfortunately. And we don't really know how to really react or present that in any sort of way. So this is the first time I've mentioned it, because now it's close to release and people will be able to actually see. But it's kind of it is an intertwined story of 3 characters set in a world that is procedurally generated but also isn't. So it's sort of procedurally laid out, but all of the main story bits are handcrafted in semi-isolated locations. But then they're weaved through this sort of gameplay, more systemic stuff that you would be familiar with from early access. So it's a game that really sort of doesn't have any direct comparisons. Did some market analysis in terms of, hey, what are your closest comparators? Because we didn't have a clue, and they said, oh, it's probably Dishonored. And we're like, guys, you're just throwing out a lot of names here. No, Skyrim, Dishonored, Bioshock, Deus Ex, Thief. And we're all like, okay, well, that's really great that those are what we're being compared to.
Yeah.
Again, still much the team. But in any event, the way I describe it now is it's an action-adventure narrative game set in a dystopian 1960s British universe, and the rest you can go for yourself, because quite frankly, I certainly can't explain it to you.
So we can go into that story of multiple perspectives a little bit more. How does that actually work, and how is the story told, and how does it jump around from one character to the next? How does that work?
It's quite linear. So there's not a lot of jumping between characters. It's really just you play a character, you play the next character, and then you play the final character, all in a row. You don't get the choice of selecting which character to start with or anything like that, which was a decision that we made probably about 1.5 years ago now, because we realized that we can tell a more in-depth story if we control the order in which the characters appear. So we can hint at things in the first character that aren't revealed until the second character, and that sort of thing. The way the characters interrelate in the game is that they do meet each other, but they have slightly different perspectives on those meetings, which is quite interesting, I think. And so, for example, the way Sally sees the city and the way the city sees her is very, very different to Arthur, the main character that you start out as. Again, it's not like most stories you've seen in video games. It's not really about the big bad guy and, you know, getting a sword and fighting and doing all that stuff. It's more a story of the collapse of a society as seen through the eyes of 3 of its inhabitants, if that makes sense.
I think what interests me as well is the inspirations. I mean, the studio's made open comparisons to 1984, Brazil. What would you say the biggest inspirations behind the story and the theme and stuff, and why did you go for that? Why did you go? Because it's quite a left field setting. How did that all come about?
So that really depends on who's answering the question. I think the nature of inspiration is that people draw different elements from different things, and if you're lucky, then it all sort of comes together quite nicely. So I personally think Brazil is the most appropriate reference, but other people would tell you it's Clockwork Orange or something like Blow Up, which I only recently saw, so it certainly wasn't an inspiration for me. How that all came about was we basically said there are a few little things that we want to talk about. One of them was masks, one of them was drugs, and one of them was dystopia. We started with that and we said, okay, well what are the inspiring things? What are the various references we can use to understand better those various elements? So our narrative director was particularly interested in the drugs angle, and particularly how that related to society at the moment. Yeah. Particularly, he's American, and the American prescription drug culture. And in his words, you know, if you have anything wrong in American society today, it's okay. There's a pill for that. Me, I was much more into the dystopian 1984 stuff. I'd read that a couple of years before, and it sort of really affected me quite a lot. And Brazil did the same thing when we watched it early on. And then our art director was probably much more interested in the general setting. So she became just super interested in the 60s England, particularly because of its juxtaposition between this older society that's come to grips with a really difficult, quite destructive last 20 years. But at the same time, you've got this remarkable optimism for the future. So you have the old sort of mining towns versus the mod 60s and the crazy retrofuturism space age stuff. And so she felt that was hugely rich and thematic. And once people get excited by stuff, it's about how you can mesh all of that together into something that's cohesive. So you end up with an island off the coast of England that's had a traumatic thing in the past, and they're all taking pills to forget about it and stay happy. And yeah, suddenly you've got We Happy Few, I guess.
How does the procedural generation work with all? You've got all this. It's rich in story, yet it's built around kind of procedural generation. So can you explain a little bit about how that works and how that kind of meshes in together?
Yeah. So these days the procedural world is think of it like the glue that holds everything together. What it does is provide a slightly different experience for each player. So for example, you won't be able to go online and find a map of the game, except at an abstract level. But what the procedural system does is a couple of things. The first, it meant that we could focus on the narrative areas and then not worry too much about how it was all threaded together. I've said this in the past, but it was quite a good development tool for a smaller team. I don't know if we do it again next time, because certainly the last 3 years has been us moving much further away from procedural. The second thing that it does, which I think is quite cool, is that in between the characters, the maps change as well. So you don't have a static layout that you've already been through. It's a new world, and you have to experience it with that new character. And you realize that, or at least I hope people will realize that the way that we see cities ourselves and the way that we experience life, even if we're in the same places, can be quite different. So it's sort of a thematic nod back to joy, making your memories forget and re-explore. But that might be just a bit bullshit high concept. I'm not really sure.
It works. No, you sold it to me. And I bought that. So that's it works. So do you think that it makes the game, despite being story-driven, do you think that it still makes it more replayable in some sense? Is it replayability something you have in mind for it?
In our case, it's quite... The procedural system does lean to replayability because, again, you know what all of the major pieces are going to be, but the challenges that you have. So, for example, are you going to have all the recipes you want to do the playthrough that you're intending to do? Maybe you're trying to do a stealth playthrough and you want a specific recipe or something that doesn't come up in your playthrough. So I think so, although I think much less so than when you have something that's more sandboxy and you make of it what you make. And so that'll hopefully come back a bit more in Sandbox Mode when we go back to do that probably later this year. So we haven't abandoned the whole random procedural sandbox. It's just we focused on the story for now.
So how is the Season Pass stuff going to slot in with the rest of the game, and how is the Sandbox going to slot in with the rest of the game?
Okay, so it's good to split them because the Season Pass is different again. But we see the Sandbox Mode as just kind of a core part of the game. So it's going to be, whether you want to call that a free DLC or a free update or whatever. For us, it's just all those distinctions are marketing stuff. It's not, it doesn't really matter. What it is an update. And with Sandbox, I do think it's cool personally because I think the procedural sandbox that we have is quite unique. I also want to do that because we did promise customized world generation as part of our Kickstarter in 2015, and that's one of the last things that we promised we do, which we haven't got to yet. It's one half finishing the sort of the old design and showing people what it would have been without all of the story stuff and the higher quality and reinvestment and that sort of thing. And then the other half is just fulfilling that community expectation. Yeah, we have some funny things like people very upset that we've created a story for the game. And we're like, okay, well, I understand that, but don't worry. The pure survival, hate your life stuff is going to come back. Don't worry. The inner masochist in you will be happy. Yeah, so that's the Sandbox stuff. It's pretty cool. I mean, I'd love personally to get some sort of free modding support as well, because I think that the engine and the procedural system that we've created is kind of really neat. Yeah. Because you just need to swap a few assets and suddenly you've got a completely different world that builds itself. Yeah. That's really cool, but I don't know if I'll convince people to do that.
Is that something that you're working on, or is it just a cool idea at this point? Or
cool idea at this point. If the game blows up and people are super excited about the idea of modding, it'll be a little easier for me to get that across the line. I just think it could be an extremely cool tool, but maybe I'm just wrong. So then we have the Season Pass stuff. We copped a bit of flack for announcing a Season Pass about a year ago, which I've always sort of struggled to understand, because for us, the Season Pass stuff is a way for us to use our team once we've finished work on the game. We started DLC work probably 3 weeks ago. Teams had finished up on the actual main game, and we'd restricted mostly just to programmer bug fixing. For us, that's probably the next year of development is on Season Pass stuff. And what we're going to do is focused more on, again, on story stuff, because we think that telling different and unusual stories that perhaps don't care so much about the main plot in Wellington Wells, and they focus on some of the more interesting characters that we have, could be really interesting and could be really fun. But the main goal is basically to work on that, and then hopefully by the time we finish that, we'll be ready to start working on something new.
Sam Abbott, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your time.
My pleasure.
So that was part one of our interview with Sam Abbott from Compulsion Games about We Happy Few. There's actually a little bit more to this interview, which we'll upload as a separate video. That's going to be all about Compulsion Games' relationship with Microsoft. Microsoft recently acquired the studio, so I wanted to know a little bit more about that. Look out for that video in the next couple of days.
Microsoft's just asked us to join their team. And I was like, really? Why?